Everybody, and special thanks to Josh and Gemma for sharing ideas with us. Uh, Before we begin, we are recording the formal presentation. When we get to Q&A and general conversation, we will switch off the recording in the interest of confidentiality. Please do not quote anybody from the conversation without their prior permission. Uh, that's a given for us. America 250 offers museums an opportunity to reflect and re-examine aspects of our national history. This year, all kinds of museums can engage in historical programming. In effect, all museums can, if they choose, become history museums, at least for a while. This is especially true for American Jewish museums. One opportunity is to examine little known but significant stories. The history of American anti-Semitism, for instance, could do with greater attention. Here, Pamela Nadel's new book, Anti-Semitism and American Tradition, can serve as a model and guide. A second approach is that of comparative history. Scholars have long neglected stories of interaction and cultural exchange between minority communities. Hasia Diner's work, including her 2024 book, Opening Doors, The Unlikely Alliance Between the Irish and the Jews in America, offer examples of how to do cross-cultural history. The third promising avenue entails exploring American Jewish memory. Beth Wenger's book, History Lessons, The Creation of American Jewish Heritage, provides a case study uh, of how American Jews have chosen to recall their history as against what actually happened. As she shows, this can transcend the myth-busting attitude and instead complicate our narratives by reflecting on the interplay of memory and history. Yet another way into the American Jewish experience is through Jewish communal creativity. By this, I do not mean individual cultural expression, but the many ways Jews have created new institutions and traditions as they adjust to continuing changes in the Jewish community and the larger society. Two good examples are Vanessa Oak's Inventing Jewish Ritual and Rachel Gross's Beyond the Synagogue, Jewish Nostalgia as Religious Practice. We're privileged to hear from Josh and Gemma about their initiatives. After their presentations, we'll open the floor for Q&A and conversation. While Josh and Gemma are presenting, feel free to use the chat function to offer comments, pose questions, or cite relevant resources. Josh, you're on.
Okay, thank you. And I will say we're a small group. I mean, I'm happy, and I know, Freddie, I'm sure has uh, opinions and thoughts and ideas about this. Marcia, I know you're working on many things with many people, and Abby's working with me on a project and maybe on other projects, and CAJM and others are probably doing things as well. And I think, for me, the first and most important thing, I think, and this is going to be stating the obvious, is that, we're all planning these events, however long we've been planning these events or ideas or exhibitions or performances or whatever they are, in probably a much different political context than when we started them. Especially those of us who are planning exhibitions, as everybody knows, exhibitions have a long lead time, and Gemma, I think this is probably true of you as well. The exhibition that I'm going to mention in my remarks um, began at a very different time in history and is opening at a very different time in history. And if not to put a finer point on that, I don't know what gets around the old internet or other circles, but you may have seen footage recently of signage being removed from Independence Mall, from the president's house. So all references to slavery, enslaved people, or the fact that George Washington in his house had slaves on the corner of 6th and Market in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, is literally being removed from history. Or I suppose we could say removed from the present and hopefully not removed from the future. And so, I think that, Gemma, you and I can maybe talk about this people can talk about this, about how that may have impacted kind of the trajectory of our projects. But, you know, it is the reality that we're all living in. And I think that the second thing that is really striking for me about planning for the 250th has a lot to do with location. And so, because I am working with the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History on a major exhibition that will open this April, of which the American Jewish Historical Society is a generous lender to the exhibition. So we are grateful to them and their support. Um, this is an exhibition that will literally open across the street from Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell. And so the fact of the location of the Weitzman is pretty informative and um, weighs heavily in terms of how the Weitzman does many different things, but certainly how we're going to tell the story of the 250th. And Gemma, you can talk about New York, but certainly Philadelphia is going to be a busy territory for telling stories about the 250th. In addition to World Cup and the All-Star Game and many other kind of public events that will bring lots of different types of people into the city over the course of 2026, and I would think mostly during the summer of 2026. So location is one consideration, but also there's the question of audience, like who are you speaking to? Especially when you're doing an exhibition. This is not a theater performance, it's not a movie, it's not an art installation, it is an exhibition. And when you're thinking about an exhibition, we at the Weitzman thought, considered heavily, is this an exhibition for the Jewish community of Philadelphia to celebrate their own history and heritage in this particular city? Or is this an exhibition that hopefully will invite some of those people who will come to Philadelphia as tourists, that will invite them into the opportunity to explore the Weitzman, and in doing so, learn a little bit about American Jews at the time of the nation's founding. And I will say, and it probably won't surprise anybody in this call who knows me, that the Weitzman lean toward the latter. And more so, knowing what the other major museums would be doing in our territory. One is doing something about the Constitution, which is still a few years away for its own 250th. One is doing an exhibition on the journey of the kind of Declaration throughout space and time and history. The Philadelphia Museum of Art is showing the art collection of the owner of the Philadelphia Phillies. So that's it. That's what they're doing. And, there is public art happening in Philadelphia. There is the beginning of a Philadelphia biennial. And in some sense, what we wanted to do was show the broad international scope of events that brought us to Independence Hall. And in many ways, Jews are kind of the essential population to be the protagonists of that story, because at the time of America's founding, Jews were not just present in the Northeast Corridor, but the largest Jewish communities in the Western Hemisphere were in the Caribbean. And all of those Jewish communities were connected to each other through business, family, friends, politics, mostly business and family, though. And so the exhibition, what we decided to do was kind of as the precipitating event, or the kind of inciting kind of drama, is actually step into American history. And I would say, Avi, actually, what I was thinking of when you were saying you give different perspectives of kind of how we might tell our stories during the 250th. And I was thinking there's another choice, and I think that's the choice that the Weitzman has made, is actually just do American history, and your protagonists happen to be Jews, right? Make it, not necessarily say it has to be a Jewish exhibition or a Jewish American exhibition, but actually our exhibition is called The First Salute. And I forget to this day what's after the colon, but it's like this, the untold story of the American Revolution, the story you never heard about the American Revolution. Please, someone check the Weitzman's webpage and tell me what it is, because I know we debated it for like months and I don't remember where it got. Um, and so when people hear about this exhibition, they're not going to hear Jews in the Revolution or Jews in the Declaration, which Jews in the Declaration would be a very short exhibition since no Jews signed the Declaration. Um, they're going to hear the untold story. And I don't want to kind of prolong my remarks or go too long. Avi, you can certainly tell me if I have more time, but suffice it to say, we're starting with the first international recognition of the new nation, which happens in November of 1776 on a tiny little island called St. Eustatius, which is, I don't know, believe me, before I started this project, St. Eustatius was not on my geographical radar, and it's actually a Dutch, it is still in Dutch hands, so I didn't have to memorize it in like whatever grade when we had to memorize every country of the world. So it was not even embedded in me early in my education. And certainly no student, having had two children who have gone through the school systems in Philadelphia no less, no children have ever heard of St. Eustatius. But St. Eustatius is where the first international recognition of the new nation took place. And that's what's called the First Salute. And that recognition was by the Dutch. And what I've learned over the course of time is that you actually can't tell the story of the American Revolution without St. Eustatius, because weapons, gunpowder, tons of gunpowder at a quantity that I can't even imagine in my head, went through St. Eustatius in order to arm Washington and his army. And those, primarily coming from Europe. If you sailed at that time, you just sailed, basically your boat would take you to St. Eustatius. And then on St. Eustatius, where the European population varied between, it's actually very interesting, between kind of about 2,000 and 20,000, depending on how many kind of sailors were on the island at any time. If we go to more of the 2 to 3,000 rate, about 30 to 40% of the people on that island were Jews. And they were Jewish, they were there because they were Jewish merchants. And there were Jewish merchants on that island because St. Eustatius was the most important connection between Europe and the Western world at that time. And they were there on that island because it was a Dutch island. And the Dutch, as a colonial power, with a little kind of moment for Stuyvesant, about a century before, but generally the Dutch as a colonial power prioritized profit over everything else. And so even if we barely said the word Jews, you actually can't tell the story of the revolution without St. Eustatius. But because we have 30 to 40% of the population of Jews on St. Eustatius, because we have famous people like the Gratzes, like Moses Myers, like Isaac Moses, like many of those other names who kind of fill our pantheons of the important colonial era American Jews, all of them had business going through St. Eustatius. All of them had agents on St. Eustatius or potentially Curacao working with them on business. And what makes St. Eustatius kind of in some ways even more fascinating and kind of a new lens at this time into stories of American Jews is the population there is largely Sephardic. So if in North America, some of the names I just mentioned happen to be Ashkenazi, what you see is business being done in St. Eustatius in English and Yiddish and Portuguese. And I'm sorry to say, my ability to read Portuguese has not been improved by this exhibition, but lucky Laura Lieben is out there in the world, and her fluent Portuguese is a very amazing help to us. And then finally, and Avi, this comes to a point that you talked about, is what St. Eustatius does is gives us an opportunity to kind of raise the point of anti-Semitism in our society without necessarily, what can I say, without like going into some of the hysteria that maybe other organizations have evidenced in their own communications about anti-Semitism, which is to say, in late 1780, eventually the British get tired of St. Eustatius being the center for munitions moving back and forth between, well, moving not back and forth, but from Europe to North America. And they order this guy, Admiral George Rodney, to invade the island. And he invades the island in early 1781. And what's the first thing he does when he invades the island? He rounds up all the Jewish men, every single Jewish man on the island, imprisons them, and literally strips their body of any visible or perhaps invisible wealth. And then he corrals all the Jewish women and children and does the same thing to them. And then he goes to their houses, and then he digs up bodies in the cemetery. And he begins his plunder of the island with Jews, although it is not limited to Jews. Rodney's selfishness ends up leading him to cause a major historic issue. But it is very clear as soon as he lands on the island that he targets Jews first. And he's bringing that kind of legacy of anti-Semitism. And it's very clear from his own writing, like he's got no love of Jews. But he's bringing that legacy of anti-Semitism into military strategy, into his thinking, into it just seems to him the most logical first step. Now, what happens is Rodney eventually spends too much time on the island plundering and trying to get rich off of this enterprise that he actually misses the French fleet of the Comte de Grasse, and which was his his actual orders were like, keep the French from North America. That's it. Keep the French from North America. But he misses that fleet. That fleet sails to the Chesapeake Bay. They create the barricade, and resupply George Washington, and that's what allows him to win the battle at Yorktown. And that is, for all intents and purposes, the end of the American Revolution. All of which to say is that we are positioning this story as a story of American history that you've never heard. But when visitors visit the exhibition, they will first and foremost hear a story that they've never heard. But moreover, they will understand the roles Jews played and the lives of Jews, the daily lives of Jews at that time in the Caribbean and in North America in ways they probably had not encountered before.
Josh, thank you very much. Gemma, I'm going to ask you to jump right in.
Actually, can I say one more thing? I should just acknowledge, because Abby Meyer is here, there is some phenomenal material culture in this exhibition, like above and beyond what I might have dreamed of. And I just want to acknowledge that Abby Meyer has been working with the Weitzman to help to identify that material culture. And so I want to give her props while she's on the call, because she's brought some amazing things to light for us, which you should all come see in April.
All I can think is I hope you named the section "You Had One Job" when he literally misses the French. It's like literally had one thing to do. Hi everybody. So thank you for having me. We have a pretty interesting approach for our 250th, which I think informs the American Jewish Historical Society's content strategy overall, because we are an archive, we're not a museum. We share space with other archives in the Center for Jewish History. And so while we are located in New York, we have a national mission to reach anybody and everybody in the United States, Canada, and beyond. And we also collect from all of the Americas, not just the United States. And so, hence how we can even help with lending artifacts to somebody's exhibition, like what Josh has described, because we actually have materials like that from Central America, Latin America, and the like. So we are taking an approach that we're sort of doing on three fronts: on site, online, and on the road. On site, we have an exhibition that will be opening in late June, done in partnership with the Center for Jewish History. So it'll be downstairs here in New York City, on our first floor, called All We Have Standing Between Us, 250 Years of Jews and American Democracy. And we have asked 12 or so co-contributors from the American Jewish history field to build out the content for this exhibition so that we have lots of different viewpoints in history covered. The exhibition will cover 7 different, what we're calling, thanks to Tony Michaels, who coined it, flashpoints in American Jewish history, because doing a survey of 250 years is impossible, or would need a much bigger gallery than what we have, or you're the Weitzman. So we didn't need to necessarily do that, but rather pick something that we felt people could relate to. As Josh said in the beginning, we also did conceptualize this exhibition between AJHS and CJH far before our current political climate, but felt like the sort of concept of debates within the Jewish community about American democracy and these issues, both the creation of it and the protection of it, were going to be evergreen. How people interpret them now that we are in a situation that we weren't quite anticipating politically when we created this a year and a half ago, people may read it differently than maybe they would have before. But that's okay. That's the beauty of telling history. People take away from it what they learn and what they want to take from it. So it will have artifacts and materials from the 7 flashpoints, starting with the American Revolution, with Laura Liebman and Adam Jortner. I think you're going to find a lot of people working with Laura, because there aren't very many people who do 1776 and do it so well. And many others, including Deborah Dash Moore and Tony and others. And so this goes all the way through the Gilded Age and some of the debates around wealth and immigration that take place during that time. And we aren't quite going to the present, but we'll stop at around 2020 and leave it a bit open-ended for those visitors. Online, we are doing 2 things. One, we are creating a podcast version of this exhibition, a companion podcast that can be listened to anywhere. You don't need to actually see the exhibit to understand the podcast, and vice versa. It will have not just the contributors from the exhibition, but also other special guests that will come in to give some of these topics a bit of nuance. When there is archival audio available, that will be used. Of course, that doesn't exist before a certain time period, so that's been a fun challenge to overcome. Lots of voiceover that may be employed. And online as well, we have partnered with the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History to have Hasia Diner, our Talking Circle guest from 2 weeks ago, teach an online week-long teacher training on the history of Jews in the United States. And that will be a 250-year survey, and a little bit more, maybe like 350 years. So that will reach our educators and our students. The podcast and the exhibition will reach, hopefully, students, teachers, and also the general public. And then in terms of the on-the-road approach that we've taken, the Weitzman is not the only place that has borrowed material. We have lent out a few dozen objects all across the country. And so the idea is that you can engage with your local museum, Jewish or otherwise, and you can engage with that American Jewish history and our historical society, even if you can't make it to New York, and maybe if you're not a podcast person, although I think everybody should be a podcast person. And so those are the kind of 3 prongs that we've taken. We have had some challenges with that. One, it's a lot to finish in a short period of time. And so trying to maximize some of this content creation and meeting these audiences where they are is both less work and more work. We have, I think, not struggled, because that implies something negative, but really grappled with and considered how things may be perceived in the current in a way that historians often don't need to, but that is curating for the public is a little bit different from writing a book or an article. And so having to adjust our approach in a few ways, and being able to respond to what we feel like is a responsibility as a historical society, and one that is located in a building called the Center for Jewish History. How do we reconcile how people feel in the present about democracy, about the United States, and what that history now means? I will say we have chosen not to whitewash anything, but rather not to devolve into cynicism, even as we address the very complicated and difficult issues. And I think that's very important, that it is not our job to depress or even inspire, but it is our job to educate and to make people aware of the materials in the collection and what they mean for the history of the United States. I will say one kind of 3 or 4 different people have made the joke. Is this going to be the 4th season of our podcast, The Wreckage, which was a Cold War story? It is not. It's not funny. Stop saying that. American democracy is very strong. It does require active participation. And I think that's the crux of what our exhibit, podcast, and teacher training will really get across, that throughout history and throughout American history, American Jews were not simply, we happen to be there as a group, but also have been there the whole time, and taking various roles. And so what does that really mean for interpreting that history and understanding it? So some of the kind of fun parts, some of what's included in the exhibit are things that maybe haven't been on display before or were, but then a pandemic hit and we had to take them down, such as an interactive where you can actually read through Emma Lazarus's manuscript of all of her poetry, not just the New Colossus, but including the New Colossus. That we did do before, but then unfortunately the pandemic hit. Nobody saw it. So it's back, which is going to be great, as well as materials from World War II, from the interwar period that we've never displayed before, and some more recent collection materials that are only just now available, such as from the collection of the late Congresswoman Nita Lowey, who donated her papers several years ago. She didn't get to see it come to fruition, but some of the materials from her collection and her 30 years of Congress will be on display, never before seen by anybody but her staff at this point. So that's very exciting. I feel like we have this opportunity to maybe remind people of what is great about the United States and what is great about American democracy and what is the role that Jews have played. So that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Obviously, questions or comments from anybody?
I just want to pick up on something that Gemma said because I think it's important. I liked how, Gemma, you're like, no, it will not be the 4th season of our podcast. I really, and neither of us really neither of us have talked about this together, but I think the two institutions are doing something that's very important, especially in the political context, is show, don't tell. But neither of us are saying, neither of us as institutions are making, in some ways, political statements. But to illustrate how hard it was to create a society based on liberty, to illustrate the diversity of that society at the time when those liberties were enshrined, to illustrate, right, those aspects that make America unique and vital and important. At the same time, like our exhibition, we're talking about the Caribbean and North America in the 18th century. Of course, we talk about slavery. Slavery was just a fact of life at that time. And so you can neither not talk about it, and in some sense, nor, especially in a Jewish context, should you overdo it. And Jews wrestled with that. You can show how Jews wrestled with the concept of slavery, of owning slaves, with their own self-identifications. And so I just wanted to pick up on that, Gemma, because I loved how you stated that one does not have to be overtly political to nevertheless make a point about our nation at this particular time.
So,
Sorry.
Gemma, both you and Gemma, I mean, when you're talking and the projects you're describing, remind me of the Ken Burns series, on the Revolutionary War. I mean, the fulsome details, just in the way you just encapsulated them, makes a lot of sense, and I think are
Although
going to
he
be
only mentioned the Caribbean like one sentence.
okay. Well, you're going to fill in a gap.
Also only mentioned Jews in like one sentence.
I know. So that's why I think that is a selling point for what you're doing and for what these projects are doing, which I've always felt is so, where are those holes in the tapestry of our culture, that we need to reweave. And I think that's extremely important. The Jewish Museum of Maryland's new core exhibit, which will open, I think, in May now, April or May, is about the Jew Bill. If the pivot, the fulcrum is the Jew Bill in Maryland, and gets to, again, a very different time, very different place, but the notion of the history of the state going way, way back is, I think, just and the diversity of the Jewish population from the beginning is a really important story. So I know I should be asking a question. I'm sorry. I just wanted to contribute something. I
I
really
should, no, keep going.
no, that's it.
I was going to say I should ping Saul because we end on the Jew Bill in our exhibition.
I mean, and it would be really interesting for somebody, and I don't know who, to do that kind of, really that summary for all of our congregations and all of our population about all of these different projects and the insights and foci that they are handling.
CAJM.
I know.
Marguerite is that way for me.
Yeah.
CAJM.
Avi, you got another book in you? I think is what I'm hearing. You got another book in you? I think you can make it. We can
Got
make
blogs. You've got blogs.
Certainly fun.
It would actually be really cool to map them all, like everything we're doing, because I love that yours and Saul's kind of, yeah.
So I'm going to jump in because I don't have a question, but I feel, Josh, that I was waiting to say museums are wrestling with these issues when you said wrestling. So either our ESP has gotten really strong, but this is so complicated, and I think the exhibit that you described, the work that Gemma's describing, the fact that all of us are wrestling with how do we show history, and is it what we know today versus what may have been written 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, and what will be written in the future, and taking down those panels, that is history in and of itself, right? That's a historic moment.
You're not kidding.
Just saying. But the wrestling with these issues is so important. And people, the populace is really smart. People are smart. People who are looking for this, they're looking for ways to understand. They're looking for evidence, right? So we're going to show them evidence. We're going to, like in the museum world, the Smithsonian is just in a really we're really in the crosshairs, and location, right? You totally get it. And our 250th programming is wrestling with how do we demonstrate judicious and appropriate restraint, no unforced errors, right? We want to demonstrate, we want to show these histories, and we want to invite dialogue and discussion, but we also don't want to cause there to be these places where executive orders get, flown here and there. So it's really, really interesting. And First Salute sounds awesome. We were trying to work together on a different kind of project. This one, I have absolutely no questions about it. I'm really looking forward to coming to Philly to see it. So not a question, but I felt like I really needed to say that, particularly Josh, and to you and Gemma. I don't know if you know, but some of the best stuff I ever borrowed from American Jewish Historical Society were those Yiddish theater posters way back when nobody was doing something as goofy as Yiddish theater, and now it's like cool. So there you go. That's all I got.
Miriam, I'm sorry, are you waving for a?
Okay, great.
Uh,
I just Avi, I'd love to popcorn off of that comment. Just because something you said really spoke to me is show them evidence. Like this thing that we as museums are, is we have these objects that are true and showing them as these tangible relics as evidence is something that like is unique to museums. And I come from the conservation world where exhibiting objects, is a double-edged sword because you share it out, but it ultimately leads to the degradation of that tangible evidence. And so one thing that we do is facsimiles or reproductions. And Jane Klinger has done speaking and writing. She's the conservator at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC, and they had a really big issue navigating using facsimiles to tell Holocaust stories because Holocaust deniers would come in and say, look, it's fake. This isn't true. If you want to use evidence, and you're making copies of it, it kind of undermines the point that that evidence is trying to make. So I'll put that in the recap thing. I'll share out Jane's information, but something also to wrestle with this evidence showing that we're trying to do is people are ready to fight back with that fake news. And so navigating those logistics within our museum world is so complicated. So that was one thought. And I guess a question I have for our speakers is, we definitely have been wrestling with these issues internally. A lot of institutions are having conversations. How do we do this? What are we trying to say? Have you gotten any feedback from audiences or external sources? Are people outside wrestling in the same way that we are internally? What's the feedback been so far?
That's such an interesting question. I feel like, for us, we've had so little feedback because everything is still in such infancy. But in terms of our programming in general, as we approach this 250th, and I do think, at least for our kind of AJHS audience and orbit, there's a lot of anxiety. And for me, as a person who's trained as a historian and who loves, I always come back to the history to find something that grounds me. It doesn't mean you diminish something that happens now by saying, oh, it's been worse before or anything like that. That's not really a helpful framework. But for me, I always went back to the chaos. And I looked for the things that maybe fixed that. I always, you would hear a lot, especially starting in 2017, look for the helpers, the Mr. Rogers. And I was like, or be the helper. Learn about the helper and then be the helper. Don't just look for the other people who are going to do it because, and if we're talking about this in the context of democracy, it is participatory or it doesn't work. And so if you are frustrated by something or if you are angry about something, then you need to figure out a way to channel it because somebody else isn't going to do it for you. And that's okay. But it is a social contract that we have. And I think looking back to these 7 kind of periods in history that we've been looking at, there have been antagonists, there have been people who wanted to help, and there have been everybody in between. There have been recipients of help. And so I look at the way that communities haven't necessarily been divided, but even communities that largely agree with each other or are largely on the same political spectrum like Jews, doesn't mean that American Jews, always have one monolithic kind of voice. Very, very different, actually. And so for us, I think, and for me personally, a lot of it is that kind of anxiety of oh my gosh, is anybody going to even want to go to an exhibit like what you're doing? Because are they going to be depressed? Are they going to, who even wants to hear more of it? Oh, they're just going to be reminded of bad things. And I'm like, well, that's just life. But I think the value is seeing the material, seeing this amazing group of scholars come together to provide historical analysis and answers, and maybe to be around other human beings who are experiencing the same thing. I think the thing that I love about going to museums is the communal experience. And so being able to provide that in our space or, to help other people provided in their spaces, like that's really gratifying. And hopefully people find some kind of comfort, excitement, and inspiration in that.
Gemma, I have a quick question for you. You had said that you have an exhibition focusing on 7 flashpoints. Have you shared those with other local Jewish historical organizations? A, and B, in loaning material, have you encouraged them to pick up on those flashpoints? Not all 7 necessarily.
That's a really good question. We have not shared in any kind of specific way, but we have shared with certain partners as we've been developing the content, especially as we've been looking to borrow some items ourselves for things where there might be holes in the collection. And I would say what's been really interesting, Beth Wanger talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but we took the longue durée approach. We were like, let's take this longer history and tell it. One, so it can stay relevant longer because July 4th, 1776 / July 4th, 2026 is one day. And so how do you keep people coming back and keep engaging with it? But I also found that a lot of the places that we were reaching out to saying, hey, we have these materials, and once you reached out to us, we're working pretty far ahead and we're working quicker than my partner at the center and I were. And so they kind of told us what they needed before we knew what we needed, which is just a process kind of thing on our end, which I think is kind of funny. So I've seen what other places are doing, and a lot of them are early American, of course, but I think a lot of places are about to show the public some really creative stuff. But no, it hasn't been as organized as what you're describing, unfortunately. That would have been great though.
It seemed to me that you might you have the opportunity, perhaps not necessarily to show, but perhaps to help these local organizations frame their interpretation through those 7 flashpoints, which would be very helpful. And even if they don't adopt one of those 7 or several of those 7, they may find their own flashpoints. The very model of thinking about flashpoints is really a pretty interesting one, all told. On the subject of validation and just blunting the politics of it, Alan Taylor, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, last week, when asked exactly that question, said that his prescriptions, as best he could frame it, was stick to the primary sources.
Yeah.
Nothing helps like a good primary source. The fact of that source is hard to dispute, and you can let the people of the time speak for themselves. It's a little hard to avoid that one. Giving voice to the contemporaries, the historical contemporaries, is a sure way of pushing the conversation a little bit away from the moment, that is our contemporary moment, and back into the moment of the past, which is the one that's really critical to get across. So very helpful.
Said like a true historian.
I want to add to that, because one of the things that I think museums can serve to do is this idea that history isn't a moment, it's not frozen, right? The more we know, the more we can know, right? The more we can understand as our instrumentation develops, right? We can look deeper and further, and we can take material, and this goes exactly to what Margalit, you were saying. When the Holocaust Museum first opened, issues around human remains weren't at the forefront of museology as they are, right, 30 years later. So moving those objects into protective status, whether for conservation or for human reasons, and replacing them with a photograph, that shows that history changes. At the moment when we opened, that was like, how can we not show these mounds of human hair? It was horrible. And then we realized not only were they degrading, but it was human remains. And as the museum grew and evolved, we understand it. And so when I said, the history that we, next year, 10 years from now, people who are going to be celebrating the 500th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence are going to look back and say, in 2026, look what happened in Philadelphia at the National Park Service. That's a historic moment. So I think museums are really in this cool place of we don't have a test or a time frame like they do in the schools, and we can demonstrate with evidence and our sophistication as we keep moving forward, right? If we didn't have microscopes and telescopes, think of all the stuff we wouldn't know. So mean, I just want to encourage us, and I feel like in a time when there's so much I don't know, despair, cynicism, that we need some hope. So I hope that helps you.
Great.
Well, and this primary source idea, now I can't remember the wonderful guy who was at GW and did two
Roy
stints
Rosenzweig,
yes. Well, no, not Roy Rosenzweig, did you say?
who started the digital.
Yeah, no, yes, of blessed memory. But there's another guy um who did like 2 years at the National Park Service, and what he worked on with the park rangers, like at Manassas and some of these battlefields, was exactly that in terms of using primary sources.
House Granstead?
No,
Oh.
he's an African American. I'm picturing him. I'm so sorry. But anyway, if I remember, I'll send it to everybody. But the thing that shocked me, I went to Philadelphia twice in the last 2 years, and each time I went to that outdoor exhibit just to check to make sure it was still there. And the last time I was there was the very end of October, and it was still there. So it was very sad to me that, now it's going park by park by park in taking down all this stuff. So, and even the primary sources, I just wrote a thing about AI. I talked to Judith Rosenbaum recently, and she said she has a full-time person who's engaged with combating the bots who keep wanting to come in and suck up her content to use in who knows how. So I don't know. It just goes to Marguerite's wonderful comments about the facsimile, and some of the other issues that our field needs to deal with, I guess.
Great.
Jim Horton, yes.
There
Thank
we
you.
go. Okay.
Of blessed memory.
All right, we're right at the end of the hour. We're going to wrap up. I want to remind everyone here and those who see the video after that on the first Thursday in February, which is the 5th of February, we have a talking circle with Anne, and she will talk about CAJM and its initiatives, and particularly about submission of proposals for panel conversations at the next conference in Detroit. So if you are interested, please do join that conversation. She'll answer any and all questions at that time. Josh and Gemma, thank you very much. This really was lovely and informative on all counts. Very much appreciate your sharing with us. And I hope that these things work out successfully in the event. So we will look forward to July 4th with great anticipation. It may only be a day, but it'll be an important day, and we'll look forward to it. So take care.
Thanks to everybody else who's making all the efforts for this year.
Thank you.
It's gonna be a thing.
Take care.
Thanks all. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Stay warm.